There's a small town, hidden among hills and mist, where people speak in hushed tones about the old hollow house. It's an ancient, decaying mansion at the edge of town, long abandoned, its windows cracked, and the ivy creeping up the walls like fingers reaching to drag it back into the earth. For years, no one has lived there, and the locals rarely go near it. It's not that they don't know the house's history, it's that they do. When Emma first heard about the hollow house, she was just passing through, traveling on business. She had heard the whispers, the stories from the older folks in town about the house, but she brushed them off as mere superstition. Curious, though, she asked the local innkeeper about it. "Stay away from it," the innkeeper warned, his hands shaking as he wiped the counter. "It's not just an old house. Some things never leave, Emma. They can't, and it's waiting for someone to come back." She laughed it off, convinced it was just a local myth, a way to spook tourists. But still, the idea of the house lingered in the back of her mind. By the time her business was finished, Emma found herself standing at the edge of the overgrown driveway, staring up at the hollow house. The mansion loomed above her, and she could feel the weight of its history pressing down on her chest. Something in her gut told her to turn around, but she couldn't. Her curiosity outweighed the discomfort. Ignoring the feeling of dread, she pushed open the rusty gates. The air around her was thick, like stepping through an invisible barrier. She took a deep breath and walked up the broken path, her footsteps slow, deliberate. The front door was slightly ajar, as if inviting her inside. She hesitated, but, fueled by the need to explore, pushed it open. The hinges screamed in protest, the sound echoing through the empty house. The air inside was stale, thick with dust. As she stepped inside, the faint smell of something old and forgotten lingered. But it wasn't just dust. It was a mix of mildew and something else she couldn't quite place. The house seemed to stretch on forever, its rooms wide and shadowed, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper, yellowed with age. Yet, there was an odd feeling about the place. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt like the house was waiting for her, watching her every move, every breath. Emma's footsteps echoed as she wandered through the grand foyer, her eyes scanning the broken furniture and empty frames that once held photographs now lost to time. As she passed one room, the door creaked open slightly, as though it had been nudged by an unseen hand. A chill ran down her spine. She stepped in, curiosity pulling her further. The room was cold, darker than the rest of the house. There was an old wooden chair in the center, facing a dusty window that let in barely any light. As she stepped closer, she noticed the floorboards near the chair were uneven, almost hollow. She knelt down to investigate, brushing away the dust with her fingers. To her shock, the floor beneath the chair was slightly raised, like something had been hidden beneath it. Without thinking, she found the edge of the wooden plank and pulled. It groaned in protest but gave way, revealing a hidden trap door. Her heart raced as she stared down into the darkness below. She couldn't help herself. She had to see what was down there. Emma grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight, casting a beam into the blackness. What she saw made her blood run cold. The room below wasn't a cellar, as she had expected. It was a small, enclosed space, too small to have been a storage room. But the walls, there were symbols carved into them, symbols that twisted and spiraled in unnatural patterns, like something ancient, something that didn't belong. Her flashlight flickered, casting long shadows over the strange markings. Her hand trembled as she reached down into the hole, but before she could pull herself into the space, a sound came from the corner of the room. A faint whisper. "Emma." She froze. The voice was soft, distant, but it had come from within the room itself, not from anywhere outside. Her heart pounded in her chest. She told herself it was just the wind, the house settling, but something deep in her gut told her otherwise. "Who's there?" she called, trying to steady her voice. For a moment there was nothing, just the creaking of the house and the rustling of the wind outside. Then, the whisper returned, louder this time, almost desperate. "Don't go down there." Her skin crawled, and she quickly climbed back out of the hole, closing the trapdoor with a loud thud. The air in the house seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as if something had shifted. She backed out of the room, her mind racing. Maybe it was just her imagination running wild. She had read enough ghost stories to know that fear could make you hear things. But something wasn't right. She could feel it. She moved through the house quickly, her steps quickening as she passed the shadowy corridors, until she reached the front door. She had to get out. The door was almost within reach when she heard it, a sound coming from the kitchen behind her. A faint sound, like footsteps, light but distinct, echoing across the wooden floor. Frozen, she turned slowly. The kitchen was dark, but she could just make out the shape of a figure standing in the doorway. A man, tall and gaunt, his face obscured by shadows. But the most unnerving thing was that the figure was staring directly at her, as though he had been waiting for her all along. "It's not over, Emma." Her breath caught in her throat. She knew in that moment that the house had been waiting for her, for someone to come back. She had read the stories about how people went missing in the house, but she never thought it could happen to her. The man stepped forward, and in the dim light she could see his face, or what was left of it. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his bones, his eyes hollow and dark. "You should never have come here," the figure whispered, his voice rasping like dry leaves. Before she could react, the door slammed shut. The walls of the house groaned as if the structure itself were alive, closing in around her. The floor beneath her feet seemed to tilt, and the walls began to ripple, the symbols from the cellar flashing before her eyes, glowing faintly. She turned to run, but the hallway stretched on forever, like an endless maze of twisting corridors. The whispers grew louder, the voices of those who had been trapped in the house long before her. She could hear them now, calling her name, their voices growing more frantic with every step she took. "Emma." With every breath she took, the air grew colder. The house was no longer just a house. It had become a living thing, hungry for her, desperate for her to stay. The walls seemed to pulse with a sickly energy, as if the very foundation of the house was alive, feeding on her fear. The last thing Emma saw before the darkness closed in was the face of the man, his eyes wide with hunger, his mouth stretching into a grotesque grin. And then, there was nothing. The Hollow House had claimed its next victim.